Sausalito, do you have any affordable housing incentives currently, or?
That I'm aware of at this time, we are not actively incentivizing affordable housing within ADUs. I think we are mostly just encouraging the expansion of units on the market. And
Great. Okay. The next question was for an unincorporated Southern Marin ADU. What is minimum required for a kitchen? So it's a full kitchen, and if you're building a JDU, it's that efficiency kitchen definition that Rebecca spelled out. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions here. What is meant by 5-year amnesty? This was mentioned earlier in the presentation. Um, how about I can let Josh take this because it's a state law, and then any of the jurisdictions can add if things are different or for their jurisdiction.
Yeah, so the state said that cities have to basically allow units that were built without permits to have a process where they address only life safety emergency issues and get a 5-year pass before any enforcement actions are taken. It really is a little challenging. This is something where you'll definitely want to talk to your city before going down this path. And don't be afraid. It's not like they're going to come and chase you down if you just ask them how it works. But some cities interpret that pretty liberally. They really work with homeowners to allow you to bring it up, address the safety issues. And some cities tend to say everything's a life safety issue. Oh, the ceiling height is 1 inch too short. That's a life safety issue. So some cities are really they're not really, they don't want people to take advantage of that part of the state code. So it'd be interesting to hear from the cities how they're implementing it. But it basically gives you 5 years to bring it up to code before the city will take enforcement action.
For Belvedere, again, we do look towards having, an amnesty program, and the city has actually done an amnesty program a number of years ago to get some additional units that were built illegally as well too. So again, the more units we can get and legalize, I think the better off we'll be.
And Sausalito had an amnesty ADU program that ran, and it closed earlier this year at the end of March. I don't know if we have any plans in the works for running another amnesty ADU period. Christy, do you know?
Yeah, we are proposing to council tomorrow night, actually, that it get extended to December 1st of 2021.
Great. Okay. Maybe, okay, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll try to answer the rest of these questions. And if we can't, I'll send you emails with answers to these questions. So this question is, why is a detached different? Why are rules for detached ADUs different than attached rules? Maybe Josh can start with kind of a general answer to this, and the jurisdictions can feel free to chime in.
There comes a time in state law where you stop asking why and you just say is. Why is it? I don't know. I'm not sure if I can come up with a logical reason why it is. I mean, in some cases you want to be more permissive because there's already a building there. So some cases you want to be more permissive of other things besides a detached. But why state law kind of penalizes attached ADUs a little bit. It's not a huge difference, but a little bit. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. The others have thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, for me, reading the state laws, it seems quite arbitrary. I don't know if any of the other planners have thoughts on that. Okay. All right, so we have some more questions here, which is great. Keep the questions coming. But I think we're going to hear from Ruth now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ruth. I'm the program manager for the Community Land Trust Association of West Marin. A community land trust, for those of you who may not be familiar, acquires properties and either sells or rents the housing while continuing to own the ground. In this way, we take the cost of land out of the cost of housing, making it affordable and ensuring that the housing will be affordable forever. How a CLT operates is another story, but I'm here tonight to talk about being a landlord and share my experience of helping people become landlords through the Real Community Rentals program. So the Real Community Rentals program is an initiative of the Community Land Trust Association of West Marin, and offers incentives for homeowners to create a rental on their property and set the rents at reasonable rates. This program evolved out of the countywide Landlord Partnership Program. The Landlord Partnership Program offers incentives for landlords to create new rentals or use existing rentals to house people with Section 8 vouchers. And incentives include things like a zero interest loan with principal deferred and loss mitigation funds. So the Real Community Rentals program, well, out in West Marin, we have very few Section 8 voucher holders. And so the very same incentives were extended to landlords willing to create a rental and set rents below market rates. So that in a nutshell is what the Real Community Rentals program is, and it is limited to West Marin. West Marin landlords can receive that zero interest loan to create a rental and the loss mitigation monies as well. One of the most used incentives, though, has been assistance in becoming a landlord and finding a good tenant. Most of the homeowners participating in this program have either had a bad experience being a landlord, or they've never been a landlord and they were nervous about becoming one. Next slide. Great. So, common landlord mistakes and how to avoid them. Due diligence. One of the biggest mistakes that landlords make is selecting a tenant based on a gut feeling. Everyone likes to think they're good judges of character, and so they often avoid doing the due diligence, such as checking references and credit. Don't skip this part of the process. Call the previous landlords of a prospective tenant and ask how they were as tenants. Did they take good care of the place? Did they get along with the neighbors? Did they pay rent on time? Do also obtain a credit report for a prospective tenant, not just a credit score. A report will tell you many things, like what kind of credit they use and how responsibly they use it. A score by itself doesn't tell you very much. Do verify that a prospective tenant has enough income to support the rent. If their income isn't 3 times the amount of the rent, they might run into trouble when life throws inevitable curveballs, and they will struggle to make their rent payments. Rental agreements. You know, there are many people who have no formal rental agreement. They basically moved in on a handshake. A good written rental lease or agreement helps avoid conflicts down the road. There are lots of good templates available, and they can be edited to include any provisions that the 2 parties agree to. For example, you can include a provision restricting what kind of auto repairs can be done on site in order to avoid broken down cars parked out front for long periods of time. You can even add COVID considerations, like restricting the number of guests that a tenant could have at any one time to avoid large gatherings. It's a good idea to check landlord-tenant laws to be sure you're not putting any illegal provisions into your lease. The California Landlord's Law Book by Nolo Press is my go-to resource for landlord-tenant laws. It's well organized, it's easy to find what you need. It has numerous sample forms and notices and rental agreements. For example, this is probably never going to happen to you, but what happens if you notice a tenant's possessions are gone and you suspect they've abandoned the unit without notifying you? The NOLO book will advise you on the proper waiting periods and the proper notification process. Don't expect to find a tenant who's never home and never makes a sound. Tenants are real people. Do be a good neighbor and cultivate good communication. Welcome your tenant and invite them over for a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. Get to know each other a little. Having good communication and rapport with your tenant is super important. A tenant who feels valued and respected will be a good tenant, and a good tenant is gold. Next slide, there we go. So how do you find a good tenant? Well, you can advertise in different places. You can advertise on social media, Craigslist, your local paper, by word of mouth in your network. It's a good idea to familiarize yourself with fair housing rules before you advertise for a tenant. In most cases, you will be allowed to select an individual tenant, but you may not advertise for a single tenant because it discriminates against families and therefore violates fair housing law. Setting rents. When you go to set rents, maximizing your rental income is often not the only consideration. Setting a fair rent will help you attract and keep good tenants. And like I said, a good tenant is gold. It's worth a lot. Of course, if you financed your construction with a loan, you've got to consider your loan payments and the length of the loan in setting your rental price, but consider pricing your unit so that it's affordable for the local workforce who might not be able to afford high rents in the county. And lastly, I want to mention about setting security deposits. How do you determine a fair security deposit? California law prohibits collecting last month's rent in the security deposit. And if you make the security deposit the same as the monthly rent, people tend to use it as the last month's rent, even though they're not supposed to. This is where I use the credit report. If a tenant's credit is good, I will set the security deposit at less than a month's rent. If their credit's poor, but their references are great and their income supports the rent, then I'll set the deposit higher than a month's rent. But that's just a strategy that I use and have advised landlords to do. And I think that is about it. We have questions.
Thanks, Ruth. Does anyone have specific questions about renting out their ADU? If you can put it in the question box. Otherwise, we will think of some questions. One question, just while we're waiting. Could you talk a little bit more about the Landlord Partnership Program and just the advantages of that?
The advantages of the countywide landlord partnership program? Well, sure, because so if you are renting to a Section 8 voucher holder, the housing authority will pay you nearly market rate rent, close to market rate rent. So you're going to get pretty good rent and guaranteed rent because the tenant always only pays a third of their income, and the housing authority cuts that check on the first of the month every month, and you know it's not going to be late. And you've got some support there too with that program. If you have, I think they have a hotline for landlords. If you have trouble with your tenant, there's a hotline you can call. Some of the loss mitigation funds, let's say you find a great tenant, but they don't have enough money for the security deposit, you can get the security deposit money from the housing authority. And if they should move out and do damage beyond the security deposit, again, you've got loss mitigation monies from the housing authority that you can access.
Great. Josh, do you have any other renting your ADU questions or any other tips you want to share, Ruth? I'm not getting any more questions about renting.
Okay.
No, I think that's good. Let's think one way to avoid some problems is when you're building your ADU, remember that it is like Ruth was saying, another person who will be living there. So perhaps spend the extra money of having soundproofing and things like that if there's an attached wall. then as much as possible, don't you know, if you download a lease form, that's a good starting place, but feel free to add customizations to it that'll come up just because it's an ADU about backyards or other things like that that other people might not apply in a normal commercial rental. I'll also say, consider you don't have to rent to, there was a question, do you have to rent to an affordable level? You don't, but if you price your unit a little below market prices, and maybe rent to a teacher or other essential employee, you'll have a tenant there for as long as you want them. They'll be super appreciative and you'll be doing good for the community. So consider pricing it so a member of the workforce can actually live there. A couple tips or thoughts.
Great. Okay, we don't have any other questions. Any parting questions or comments from the panelists? If not, we can move on to our next part of the presentation.
I think the last was just any other Q&A, right? We can
Okay.
pick up a few of the questions that people had in the Q&A.
Sure. Okay. First question is, looks like a copy and pasted potentially from state law.
Well, this was something I answered. I was just answering a few after we looked like we were out of time. I thought the question was about, could you have a, maybe I misread it. I thought it was about, can I have a ADU on top of a garage? And I'll just answer that. It's no longer allowed by state law to have an ADU on top of your garage, but we could maybe just go each city by city and say which cities allow that, because cities are allowed to offer it. They just don't have to allow it. But maybe we can talk about that. And maybe the question wasn't about that, but that would be a good thing to go over.
Okay. Unincorporated county allows above a garage. We do have some height restrictions, but generally there isn't a prohibition above a garage.
City of Belvedere doesn't explicitly prohibit them, but we do have a height restriction of 16 feet. So with that restriction, I don't see how an ADU would be constructed over a garage without some type of variance or conditional use permit, design review. You would get out of that sort of ministerial approval category and you would bumped up into the discretionary review process.
And that's not everybody. Did everyone go? Sorry.
Yeah, I could chime in from Sausalito. We're in transition where our planning commission has made some recommendations to council, which we'll consider those tomorrow night. But at this point in time, the planning commission recommended that the 16-foot height limit also apply to ADUs above detached garages. So we'll see if there's any, changes to that from council's input tomorrow.
I'm sorry, I should caveat my answer with that. The same thing that Christy mentioned. We had the planning commission review it and recommend approval to the council, and it will go to council this month. So it hasn't been officially adopted yet.
Okay. I will also add that we are working on our ADU ordinance. So some things could change, including a height above a garage. Okay. The next question is just SB 13. So that was one of the state ADU laws.
Jillian, I think this is a longer message from me about someone believing that state law says you're allowed to build
I see this.
Garage. The state's interpretation is that that's no longer the case. Well, perhaps if you can squeeze it under 16 feet, but that's not super practical. That's the state's interpretation. I agree with that interpretation. and we should just take it offline. I mean, it doesn't matter. You can have a different interpretation, and you could go to your city, and you might convince them you're right. But anyway, I agree with the state's interpretation that it's no longer, cities no longer have to allow it for sure. It maybe if you can squeeze it under 16 feet, but that's really not feasible. So.
Okay. The next question, is there a way to separate mailing addresses for the ADU tenants? Yes, at the county at least, one of the last steps is creating that address for the ADU. But I think other jurisdictions could speak to if a separate mailing address is required for the ADU.
For Belvedere, again, we require a separate address for the ADU. It may be, just have an A or a B, but there needs to be a separate address.
The fire department's like that because you'll call 911 and you'll say your address and they'll know where to go. So it's a pretty common requirement. And it's not that hard. There's a little fee, but then the post office assigns you something. And then how about the rules about, it sounds like I want to build a new garage for my new ADU. Someone want to comment about the rules associated with building new garages for an ADU?
I can go ahead for Belvedere. Any new garage would be subject to the zoning requirements of the underlining zoning district. I think even though it would be built for an ADU, there's nothing specific in the code that addresses a garage, so it would default to the underlining zoning district.
Same for unincorporated. So this person is writing from unincorporated Nevada. I think it's important for all the jurisdictions to address this, but we would have the same approach. So you would have to build a new garage with the underlying zoning. There isn't an incentive or different regulations code that would apply for a new garage for a new ADU.
I believe Sausalito would also have the same approach. We'd have to get permitted and building permits as a garage, and then separately get zoning permit and an ADU zoning permit and building permits to be converted to an ADU. So
got it. Okay. I'm thinking that Tiburon is the same way. I don't think that they have an incentive for ADU garages. So let me just, while I look in the chat box to see if we missed any questions. If not, I don't think we did. There was a question specifically about Tiburon. I'm going to send this question to the planning director because I don't know the answer to that. Otherwise, if there are no other questions, I think we'll, we have one more poll. Let's do the poll, see if we get any more questions. So I will launch the poll and give everyone 30 seconds, and I'll give you a little warning. Thank you so much for asking all those questions. They were, I think, really good questions, and hopefully you got some answers, especially about who to contact at your jurisdiction. 5 more seconds. Okay. Some people are still responding. I'll give a little more time. All right. So, well, no one has questions about getting started. I think this is very common, just questions about design permits and building, because I think it really comes down to a case by case basis, type of ADU that's right for me, and working with my city or town. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. You can always visit adumarin.org for more assistance. Each of the jurisdictions who is working on ADU Marin has a list of kind of a cheat sheet on the website for planning and building, including a contact person or a contact email. So if you have any more questions specifically related to your jurisdiction, you can pop on there. But you too can build an ADU. And we really just want this website to serve as a place for you to get started or to jumpstart your ADU process. Any other parting words from the group?
I might just mention for those interested in ADUs in Sausalito, we do still consider view impacts. So I just want to make folks aware of that.
Thank you, that's helpful. All right. I'm just looking to see if we have any other questions. Looks like people are thanking us in the Q&A. Thank you so much for attending, and we hope you have a great rest of your night. Thanks, everyone.
Wow.